The old glad confidence uniting the planter class with the bulk of the people had been impaired. Misapprehension appeared on both sides. Too much has been said lately, however, in justification of the poorer classes, who were thus weakened suddenly to a distrust of the aristocracy, and too little has been said of the proud recoil of the aristocracy in the face of a sudden, credulous perversion of its motives. A perversion inspired by the pinching of the shoe, and yet a shoe that pinched one class as hard as it did another. It is as unfair to charge the planter with selfishness in opposing the appropriation of slaves as it is to make the same charge against the small farmer for resisting tithes. In face of the record, the planter comes off somewhat the better of the two. But it must be remembered that he had the better education, the larger mental horizon. The Confederacy had long recognized women of all classes as the most dauntless defenders of the cause. The women of the upper classes passed without a tremor from a life of smiling ease to a life of extreme hardship. One day their horizon was without a cloud, another day their husbands and fathers had gone to the front. Their luxuries had disappeared, and they were reduced to plain hard living, toiling in 1,000 ways to find provisions and clothing, not only for their own children, but for the poor families of soldiers. The women of the poor throughout the South deserve similar honor. Though the physical shock of the change may not have been so great, they had to face the same deep realities: hunger and want, anxiety over the absent soldiers, solitude for children, grief for the dead. One of the pathetic aspects of Confederate life was the household composed of several families, all women and children, huddled together without a man or even a half-grown lad to be their link with the meal and the market. In those regions where there were few slaves and the exemption of overseers did not operate, such households were numerous. The great privation which people endured during the Confederacy have passed into familiar traditions. They are to be traced mainly to three causes: to the blockade, to the inadequate system of transportation, and to the heartlessness of speculators. The blockade was the real destroyer of the South. Besides running the whole policy based on King Cotton, besides impeding to a vast extent the inflow of munitions from Europe, it also deprived Southern life of numerous articles which were hard to relinquish. Not only such luxuries as tea and coffee, but also such utter necessities as medicine. And though the native herbs were diligently studied through the government, established medical laboratories with results that were not inconceivable, the shortage of medicines remained throughout the war a distressing feature of Southern life. The ironworks at Richmond and a foundry at Salem, Alabama, were the only mills in the South capable of casting the heavy ordnance necessary for military purposes, and the demand for powder mills and gun factories to provide for the needs of the Army was scarcely greater than the demand for cotton mills and commercial foundries to supply the wants of the civil population. The government worked without ceasing to keep pace with the requirements of the situation, and in view of the immense difficulties which it had to face, it was fairly successful in supplying the needs of the Army. Powder was provided by the Mining Bureau. Lead for Confederate bullets was collected from many sources, even from the window weights of the houses. Iron was brought from the mines of Alabama. Guns came from newly built factories, and machines and tools were part of the precious freight of the blockade runners. Though the poorly equipped mills turned a portion of the cotton crop into textiles, and though everything that was possible was done to meet the needs of the people, the supply of manufactures was sadly inadequate. The universal shortage was betrayed by the limitation of the size of most newspapers to a single sheet, and the desperate situation clearly and completely revealed by the way in which, as a last resort, the Confederates were compelled to repair the railroads by pulling up the rails of one road in order to repair another that the necessities of war rendered indispensable. The railway system, if such it can be called, was one of the weaknesses of the Confederacy. Before the war, the South had not felt the need of elaborate interior communications, for its commerce in the main went seaward and thence to New England or to Europe. Hitherto the railway lines had seen no reason for merging their local character in extensive combination. Owners of short lines were inclined by tradition to resist even the imperative necessities of war, and their stubborn conservatism was frequently encouraged by the short-sighted parochialism of the towns. The same pitiful narrowness that led the peasant farmer to threaten rebellion against the tax in kind led his counterpart in the towns to oppose the War Department in its effort to establish through railroad lines because they threatened to impair local business interest. A striking instance of this was toward cooperation in the action at Petersburg. Two railroads terminated at this point, but did not connect, and it was an ardent desire of the military authorities to link the two and convert them into one. The town, however, unable to see beyond the boundaries and resolute in its determination to save its transfer business, successfully obstructed the needs of the army. As a result of this lack of efficient organization, an immense congestion resulted all along the railroads. Whether this, rather than a failure in supply, explains the approach of famine in the latter part of the war, it is today very difficult to determine. In the numerous state papers of the time, the assertion was reiterated that the yield of food was abundant and that the scarcity of food at many places, including the cities and the battlefronts, was due to deficits in transportation. Certain it is that the progress of supplies from one point to another was intolerably slow. All this want of coordination facilitated speculation. We shall see hereafter how merciless this speculation became, and we shall even hear of profits on food rising to more than 400%. However, the oft-quoted price of the latter years, when, for instance, a pair of shoes cost $100, signify little, for they rested on an inflated currency. Nonetheless, they inspired the witticism that one should take money to market in a basket and bring provisions home in one's pocketbook. Endless stories could be told of speculators hoarding food and watching unmoved the sufferings of a famished people. Said Bishop Pierce in a sermon before the General Assembly of Georgia on Fast Day in March 1863, "Relentlessness and discontent prevail.